Now, so I will briefly introduce you now. So Miriam is a professor of environment and sustainability at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in Ecuador. She also holds a PhD in sociology and a master's in Latin American studies from the Freie Universität in Berlin. And most of it, she's very active, and she's a member of many groups, including the Ecosocial and Intercultural Pact of the South.
Recording in progress.
That was not my voice. And the Latin American Permanent Working Group on Alternatives to Development, and has also coordinated the Global Working Group Beyond Development since 2016. And what is most important for today's presentation is about her research, and her research focuses mainly on critique of development, systemic alternatives, and territorial implementation of buen vivir, also combining decolonial and feminist perspectives with political economy and political ecology. And I'm a big fan, so I'm very happy to have her here. And today the title of her presentation is Green Colonialism, Global Justice, and the role of degrowth in ecosocial transformation. So I'm very happy to have you here, Miriam. I will leave you the floor for half an hour, and then, or something like that, and then we'll have, I'm sure, a very rich Q&A session. So I leave the floor to you, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Daniele. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for the organizers as a group for the invitation. I would have loved to be there in Bonn with you, to be honest. Thanks for showing me the public. That makes the interaction a little bit more direct. And yeah, I would like to take the opportunity to maybe state that in the event of the elections in the US, it gets even more important to work on alternatives, on other visions of the world, on global justice and ecosocial transformation. So I am very happy to be able to talk to you about this today. I hope you can hear me well. I guess so. First of all, I would like to just acknowledge the different collective processes that have enabled me to share what I will share with you today, because keynotes are always a very individualistic endeavor. But in the background, there are many, many people who have worked together, who have discussed around those topics. And my talk will be structured in 4 steps today. So first, I will get a brief overview of what I understand as the hegemonic answers to the current polycrisis or multidimensional crisis that we are facing. Then I will dive a bit deeper into the concept of green colonialism, both explaining some of its dimensions, how I understand it, and then give some examples. I will briefly go over what I call entanglements and interdependencies in the globalized economy and what this tells us about global justice. And fourth, I will address the role of degrowth more specifically in that panorama of ecosocial transformation. So first of all, I think it is important to understand the dimensions of the crisis that we are currently facing, which maybe has as its most visible feature global warming and the meteorological extreme events that we are living through in many, many places at the world. But this is embedded in a larger environmental crisis, which itself is only one dimension of a systemic crisis that also has very important political dimensions, the ingredient of a scandalous inequality, both within countries and between countries. We have a increase in militarization and war, an increase of people have to leave their homes and migrate to other places. And all this is somehow built on certain beliefs. For example, the belief in unlimited growth, progress, and development that underlies our modern capitalist colonial civilization today, and also the belief that everything will be solved eventually by some technological innovation and by the market. So that has led to a certain set of answers, of hegemonic answers, which my colleagues Breno Bringle and Maristela Swampa have called the decarbonization consensus, which evolves around the perspective of green growth. This concept is a step further than another concept, which was the commodities consensus, which is a Latin American term to describe what happened here at the beginning of this millennium, which was, for one, a series of countries that elected left or social democrat, pink, as it was said, governments, which promised to get out of neoliberalism and of extractivism, but then, although they did certain things to move beyond neoliberal, the neoliberal economic canon, they still deepened extractivism, and their economies relied on the export of commodities, especially to China. So that was called the commodities consensus, and that would now be shifting toward another kind of consensus around energy transition and around green growth. One example for that is the European Green Deal. But we also have the policies promised by China and promised by the US, at least by the Biden administration. We will have to see what happens now. In the context of the UNFCCC, where there is a move toward what is called the fourth industrial revolution and the replacement of fossil fuels with renewable energy sources, and a move toward green growth instead of so-called brown growth, which would be fueled by, for one, the digitalization of the economies, and as is promised, a certain decoupling of the use of materials and the pressure on the environment from this economic growth. So that are the main lines, what the hegemonic answer to the environmental threats that we face with global warming are looking like. And also in biodiversity policies, we can see the same tendencies toward market solutions, toward biodiversity credits, that would help protect the environment. At the same time, we can see that certain ideological perspectives have shaped global environmental governance in the last decades. Ideological moves that Christian Laval and Pierre Bardot have called the neoliberal reason, which is a vision that is not content with removing any limits to businesses in the name of a determined understanding of freedom, but it extends the logic of businesses and its modes of operation, which is a profit logic, right, far beyond the sphere of the market. It has extended this logic into all areas of society, into the state institutions, and even into subjectivities. So Laval and Bardot described that for the decades since the 80s, more or less, of the last century. and how neoliberal reason has also put the state itself at work to become the main lever of this extension of the profit orientation, the rentability orientation in social organization. So profitability today is what actually does determine the boundaries between what we understand as feasible, as viable, or even as thinkable in environmental governance in many, many scales and places and institutions where decisions are made. And it even can be observed that it outrules ecological effectiveness. That what I'm trying to say, for example, with carbon markets, there is quite a lot scientific evidence that carbon markets do not reduce deforestation and they do not reduce GHG emissions, but still, this is our main bet to confront global warming. Because there is an expectation of profit related to the carbon markets. And the same happens now with biodiversity markets, which we have just seen at the last COP. So there is a sort of common sense that this is the way it has to go, and this is the way, these are the instruments, this is the toolbox we have at our service. And other kinds of environmental governance, of policies, of public policies, which were more at the front, for example, in the 60s and 70s, which were more about lawsuits against polluters, about strong regulation, about fiscal policies, are pushed to a second place. The second aspect of today's environmental governance, which I would like to stress, is that it is also colonial in the context of this decarbonization consensus. So, and it is very, very contradictory because we have to acknowledge, of course, that especially after the Ukraine war broke out, there is a strong move toward expanding investment in fossil fuels and securing the fossil energies that countries have a grip on. And energy corporations rather see renewables and, for example, green hydrogen as an add-on to their fossil fuel policies and strategies. So that certain scholars have spoken of an energy expansion instead of an energy transition, although political discourse still talks about an energy transition, but it's both coexisting in reality. And at the same time, the decarbonization consensus coexists with the commodities consensus in this way. When we look at how this green colonialism plays out, we should take a moment to define what we mean by green colonialism. I would say it is the latest shape that the historically and continuously asymmetric relations of appropriation and subjugation that have existed between the global geopolitical global north and south have taken. That is, green colonialism has a long history. In the actual colonial period, in the historical colonial period, there always has been a green dimension to colonialism already, right? This is how lands were appropriated, how the forms and technologies that people in the colonized countries had developed for example, to manage their irrigation systems, for example, to manage their forests, were destroyed through colonial rule, through military colonial rule in many places, and replaced by different societal nature relations, which were imposed together with certain technologies that came from the empires, from the colonial empires by then. So that was historically green colonialism. And today, the hypothesis is that the relations of colonial appropriation have evolved through history. They have shifted their shapes, but not their nature of subjugation. And that has gone on after political independence through, for example, certain kinds of development cooperation policies, through certain global rules we will see in a minute, and through a transfer of value from the global south to the global north, which today ecological economists can even quantify. So we have a continuity in the structural relation, and we have a shifting shape. And so the latest shape is the decarbonization consensus. And the latest shape that comes to be added on what we could call the political economy of fossil energies is the political economy of renewable energies and green economy. Green colonialism plays out in 4 dimensions of imperial appropriation that today are constitutive to these policies that aim at decarbonizing certain dimensions of the economies. And their heart consists in externalizing their social and environmental costs. So I will just go into those 4 dimensions for a minute. The first one is to consider large parts of the global south as a huge reserve of raw materials that are just there to be appropriated for the energy transition of the global geopolitical powers. In terms of securing certain critical minerals, securing the lithium, securing the cobalt, securing the copper, and just pretending that this is there for certain parts of the world population and their energy transition. The second dimension is that other parts of the global south are appropriated to be potential sites for carbon offsets, or now also biodiversity offsets, because of course there are still emissions going on in production processes which are labeled as unavoidable, and then they have to be compensated through payments for conservation abroad, right, in distant places. And these conservation policies also impose a certain kind of conservation, which normally is like fortress conservation, where forests have to be empty of people, and which many times translate into new processes of dispossession of local communities, forest dwellers, indigenous peoples, because of the creation of reserves or national parks, or even private reserves. So what is important here is, of course, to not confuse the net zero presumptions of certain products or certain processes with actually being not generating any emissions, but those emissions are just compensated somewhere else. And this implies these kinds of territorial appropriation and imposition of certain global logics. The third dimension of colonial appropriation within green colonialism is the export of waste, the trade with waste, which is increasing through in the packages that come with free trade agreements. For example, my country here, where I live, Ecuador, just signed last year a free trade agreement with China, where it commits to receive large amounts of electronic waste and plastic waste from China. And there is also a flow of waste, for example, from solar panels, from the digitalized economy to West Africa, which creates toxicity there and health problems for the people. And the fourth and last dimension I would like to mention is that there is also the expectation that the Global South will be markets where the technologies, the clean technologies that will be produced in China, in Europe, in the US, in the context of this turn toward renewable energies, will be bought for high prices in the context of the global trade rules. So as I would like to show quickly some examples. For example, the picture on the left here are stacks of balsa wood. The balsa is a very light wood that is being used in the production of wind turbines in China, for example, and we have lived a very intense rush on that balsa wood trees in the Ecuadorian Amazon since 2018 specifically. And actually now it's almost gone. There is nothing left. And that has generated lots and lots of problems in indigenous communities in Amazonian territories, but always in the name of clean energy and the decarbonization consensus. The picture on the right, you will have recognized it, is lithium extraction, in this example in Bolivia, for the batteries of electric cars and other batteries and the storage of the clean energy. And we have, of course, lots of land grabs for huge wind parks, for huge solar parks. For example, in order to produce green hydrogen, which is sold as a kind of magic solution for certain industrial processes, but without necessarily taking into account the whole implication that its metabolic cycle has when you see what it implies from extraction of the materials that are needed to build those parks to disposal in the end. So that would be the perspective that we propose, to always take into account the whole metabolic cycle. And of course, all this is taking place in a neoliberalized global economy that has given itself certain rules, also in the context of neoliberal reason, of these profound changes the global economy has lived through since the late 70s and the early 80s, and where the chances of countries in the global south are very much dependent on certain frameworks, and are really, so many countries are stuck in actually not even being able to decide democratically where they would like to go, because either they are very, very indebted in terms of external debt, and a lot of their GDP has to go into the debt service, because the produce they can export on the global market will always be undervalued in the context of unequal exchange or unequal ecological exchange, because the decision-making structures, for example, within the international financial institutions are so asymmetric that a very small number of countries defines their policies in their own interest, specifically the USA. Because trade rules in the WTO are asymmetric, because dispute settlements are also processes where even public policies for the sake of the own population can be outruled and fined by the arbitrage processes, and and of course we have also internal colonialism in the sense of national elites in the global south, which feel they are a part of the global elites and act in the interest of global elites, and not in the interest of their own national population necessarily. There is the example of Indonesia, which you might know, which wanted to industrialize their own nickel they extract for their own energy transition. And then in the context of dispute settlement, the EU imposed that they had to export the nickel still to Europe. Similar things happen in Bolivia with the lithium, where several attempts to industrialize the lithium on site for battery production in Bolivia have not prospered, simply because some investment agreements that had been made, for example, with Germany, were reversed, and other investors could only be found to rather export the lithium for it to be processed elsewhere, and so on. So it is very difficult, and we cannot speak of equal conditions for countries on the periphery of the world system if they would like to engage in eco-social transformation. They are very, very restricted in their possibilities or room of maneuver because of what we would call green colonialism and all these aspects that it comprehends. So if we try to make just a quick preliminary diagnostic, we can just observe that greenhouse gas emissions are still on the rise, that the extreme meteorological events worsen and multiply, that the species loss is also on the rise, the deforestation, ocean acidification, etc., etc. And we are facing a kind of simulation of action instead of effective action. For example, in the context of all the multilateral processes, the COPs for climate change, which are held every year. We have some diplomatic successes there, for example, the Paris Agreement, but we are not seeing effective results that would save us from the threats science is telling us that we face. So we could say there is a simulation in the sense of we are changing some things superficially in order to not change the foundations of the problem, to not address them really. And one of the most important taboos in this context is not to affect economic growth. Even the SDGs, which have been an important step, of course, in their formulation within the United Nations, have not outruled the objective of growth, although we already have very much clarity about planetary boundaries, and this impossibility to keep on growing in a limited environment. So we still have an expansion, an effective expansion of our material and energy metabolism, only that now we have put it under green premises. And at the same time, we observe the exacerbation of inequalities and injustices. So the vision our world is moving toward could be described as a vision where some places are fortified as sort of islands, of clean islands, where the air will be clean, the water will be clean and available, with a lot of technological investment and innovation there, but on a surrounded by a devastated planet. The only problem here that ecological disaster does not respect borders necessarily that have been politically drawn. So it is uncertain if even this vision will be reachable in the end. And there is an evident connection between the failed environmental governance that we would have to acknowledge at that point, and the flows of migrants that move around the world looking for some secure place to live. And migration has become such a heated topic in all like in the US and in Europe, and is driving us toward more and more authoritarian political rule. So all these problems are very closely interconnected. And I would now like to take a look at the role of degrowth in ecosocial transformation. And by beginning to say that there can be no sustainable future, no really ecologically sustainable future on a limited planet without degrowth. But we have to see what we understand by degrowth. Of course, not an uncontrolled recession, as we can see it, for example, in my country, Ecuador, at that moment, where a long drought has led to the breakdown of the hydropower plants, so that we have energy shortages of 8 hours, 15 hours, even 20 hours a day through environmental conditions that have abruptly changed. And now the industry just cannot produce. But this is not what we understand by degrowth here. It's very important to state. What we mean is a controlled and planned reduction of the social metabolism, democratically planned, of the consumption of matter and energy, which is absolutely in order when we look at the future of our human societies. So the shift would be not to replace brown growth by green growth, but to replace whatever growth by planned and controlled and democratically decided degrowth. And this is argued for because of the thesis that the decoupling, the possibility to decouple economic growth from its ecological impacts is actually not possible, and where it is measured in some place, that is normally related to two myths. The first problem with this decoupling, like you could still have economic activity that creates jobs, that creates income, that creates GDP growth, but at the same time, you would be much more delicate with nature, you would need less resources, you would need less energy, etc., is based on the myth of immaterial economic processes, and which are normally, to a good extent, digitalized economic processes, but they do have material backgrounds, of course. If you take the whole metabolic cycle into account, from extraction to disposal, as I said before, every digitalized economic transaction or financial transaction, of course, does have a very important ecological footprint, all the server parks, etc. And then there is also a perspective on nationalized decoupling, like decoupling within national borders of a certain country or even parts of a country, where actually you can find figures that say that it has worked. But again, if we look at the whole metabolic cycle and at the whole value chains that are behind the economic processes that have taken place in this country, you can normally trace that this reduction of the ecological impact within the country is correspondent with an increase of the ecological impact on other sides of the planet because of the global value chains and of what people have called the externalization of social and environmental costs to more peripheral parts of the world economy. This is what Ulrich Brandt and Markus Wissen have called the imperial mode of living, or Stefan Lessenich has also called the Externalisierungssociety. So what I want to say is that decoupling is a myth, and this is why we need to get control of our metabolic cycles and move toward their reduction in actual terms. So I would like to stress some of the most important contributions that, from my perspective, degrowth scholarship has made so far. The first important contribution is about what I just said, that it has made very critical stances on the compatibility of growth and sustainability. Like in the history of global environmental governance, we have different stages of semantic conciliation, we could say, between economic processes and ecological processes, where some sort of magic terms have been invented in order to make peace between those apparently opposed needs of human societies. The first magic phrase was the one of sustainable development, but now we are seeing the ubiquity of green growth or green economy, which are always alleging that it is possible to still grow and protect the environment, right? And degrowth has been one of the strands of thought, I would say, that has been most critical with these semantic reconciliations. A second very important contribution of degrowth has been to analyze that economic growth nowadays, in the last decades, has actually become the priority of state action, of public policies, and that that should be changed toward centering on inequality, making inequality the priority of state action, and move toward redistributing the existing wealth within and between countries, which would increase the possibilities of need satisfaction without putting more stress on ecosystems and the environment. The third important contribution is how this move toward degrowth societies is described by several authors when they propose that existing economic activities should actually be assessed democratically, collectively, in order to analyze which of those actually cause harm in spite of creating jobs, like harm to human health, harm to the quality of relations, harm to our relations with the environment or to ecosystems, and which economic activities actually sustain life and generate well-being. And then we would have a new landscape emerging that would show us which economic activities and also services and care and reproductive activities should actually grow and which one we should work on degrowing, on shrinking, or even disappearing. Like it's a big reorientation in how decisions are made and how limits are also acknowledged. And the fourth important contribution of degrowth scholarship lies in how it has acknowledged historical responsibilities of the geopolitical North in its claim to, if the geopolitical North societies degrow, they would make ecological and conceptual space for the South, for the countries on the peripheries of the world system to find their own pathways toward what they would understand as a good life. At the same time, there are also many challenges for degrowth scholarships, especially when it comes to global justice, because there are still many voices around that claim that the global South still has to grow in terms of GDP growth because there is poverty there and because people have, of course, to satisfy their basic needs. And there is also a problem with this claim that degrowth in the North, just if it happens, would make space for the global South to find its own paths. In terms of the first affirmation that the global South still has to grow, what we could say is that this centering public policies and state action on growth or development understood as GDP growth, which is still the main and hegemonic understanding of development around, I would say, does cause harm in the societies of the global South too, because there is not a simple correlation, a direct correlation between GDP growth and poverty reduction or needs satisfaction. To the contrary, if we look, for example, at Latin America in the last decades, when there was GDP growth, for example, here in Ecuador during the government of Rafael Correa, that was between 2007 and 2017, there was quite good growth rates, but inequality ended up rising. Poverty was down for some years because of unconditional cash transfers, but then when the raw material prices dropped, those cash transfers couldn't pay it out anymore. Poverty rose again immediately, and the unequal structures within the country and also of the country with others in the world system had been even consolidated or deepened. So we could say that GDP growth is a motor not only of wealth for some, but it also is a motor of inequality, and that is opposed, let's say, to well-being.
Miriam.
And also, of course, in the Global South, yes?
As we have just 15 minutes, maybe if you could wrap up maybe in the next 5 minutes, so we have maybe 10 minutes at least for question, that would be great.
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
In the Global South, of course, we also have elites which are over-consuming. And well, the right side I can wrap up because I think I already have said something about that. If degrowth in the Global North should make space actually for countries of the Global South to find their own paths, this only is possible if we can challenge the global rules together, these rules that are so asymmetric, the trade rules, the debt rules, the dispute settlement rules, etc. Yeah, and for this, I would make a strong point for decolonial North-South alliances. So maybe just as a last statement, there can be no successful path toward sustainability on this planet without global justice. And it is very important to recognize the past and present asymmetries and structural injustices in terms of reparations. We have to repair the asymmetric colonial structures of our world, but also the damaged ecosystems and the damaged social fabric of our societies in North and South. We have to re-embed the economy into a new understanding of social organization with centers on social reproduction and the sustainability of life itself. And for this to be possible, we need to engage in epistemic justice. And this is about making sustainable modes of living and other understandings of the world, like they exist, for example, in peasant communities, peasant societies, in indigenous societies, in forest dwellers, small fisheries, pastoralist societies, which we normally label as primitive, as backward, as underdeveloped. We have to acknowledge that these people maybe can teach us a lot about how we can live within planetary boundaries and satisfying needs at the same time, and how our relations with nature have to fundamentally change. And this, of course, leads us to reassess also our understandings of poverty, of wealth, toward, for example, more feminist perspectives, which say that well-being is very, very dependent on the quality of our relations so that we can live lives without violence, instead of focusing so much on material possessions. And the importance of balance and reciprocity in these relations. And yeah, just my last point would be that, of course, all these struggles have to be embedded in a dynamics of cultural transformation, of how we understand the world and how we can shift those societal power relations that have brought us to where we stand right now.
Great. I was so sorry to cut you a bit back, Miriam, just that your presentation was so thoughtful and completed. I thought that have maybe at least a couple of reactions would have also been very interesting. So having said that,
I would like to apologize for the time. I actually find it difficult to talk to a screen. So
no,
yes.
But it was also great for us to listen and to think about what you were also presenting. So I would open the floor now, maybe 2 or 3 questions. I see One here in the front and one in the back. If you can be not too long in asking questions, there will be... Let's start from the back and then...
Hello, hello. Yes. I'm Armin Pasch from Miserior, and I agree very much with your presentation, your criticism to green colonialism, etc. There's just one remark on your introduction, because you also mentioned the Green Deal as part of green colonialism, and I would tend to disagree, partly at least. Part of the Green Deal of the European Union is, for example, the regulation on supply chains, EU-Lieferkettengesetz, the Nature Restoration Regulation, the Deforestation Act, and other initiatives on circular economy. And they are far from being perfect, but they do not create growth or profits or exploitation, but rather tend to limit them or prohibit them. And if you see the reactions of business lobby, of FDP, of EVP and others, they really want to get rid of it. And I think we should distinguish when you talk about the Green Deal and actually defend parts of it in the next years, because otherwise we will face a dangerous rollback in the European Union.
Maybe we collect a couple more.
You want me to react immediately? Or
maybe we can collect a couple more and then,
sure,
if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Hello, Miriam. I'm Tommaso Luzzati from Pisa. I'm an ecological economist, unfortunately since last century, and I appreciated very much most of your presentation, but I also have a kind of reflection that you, so far, green colonialism is being manipulated by vested interest in the fossil fuel and the nuclear energy, who fuel the local protest against wind power installation. And what is the reason? The reason is that, particularly offshore, but in general wind power, is so cheap that it crowds out fossil fuel and nuke. And the fossil fuel industry and nuke wants to keep subvention, and so for subsidies. And so for these reasons, renewables, even not subsidized, will not add on to other energy sources. So to speak about green colonialism is just a way to support fossil fuels and nuclear energy. And also concerning lithium and other sources, I would not be so worried, because huge deposits are being discovered in the US, in China, and also lithium is much less needed as we expected a few years ago due to the...
Yeah, that's maybe a sign. We have one last question here.
Hello, hi, my name is Lila. I'm also from Brazil. So I really like this perspective of thinking about the global south. And if we're thinking here about COP in the UN, we had COP in Colombia, we have COP in Brazil happening next year. What do you see as the potential of Latin America to actually kind of come together and be the leader that we think we can be? And what would be the steps that we would need to do to accomplish that?
Thank you, Miriam. You can, Miriam, if you want, you can address the questions.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for 3 questions. I'm very grateful you made, because actually I had an example which I was not able to show anymore at the end of my presentation, and I can dive a bit into that. To the first question, of course, I agree that every step in terms of supply chains regulation is helpful, is a step in the right direction. But, and that, of course, when we see the extreme right and the extreme market liberal forces in Europe, then, yeah, we get this impulse to defend the Green Deal, right? I share that impulse. Nevertheless, I am afraid that circular economy is also one of these semantic reconciliation terms, like those magic terms, where we will just have a term that suggests that economy can be circular. And I think that if you look into more critical research about recycling and to which extent it's actually possible and what can be really circular, then this shrinks to a very, very small part of the actually existing production processes. So we should not let ourselves be blinded by those terms, but look what actually can be done, and not let these terms push the need to reduce our social metabolism away, yeah? Because I think it's just a substitute in order to avoid degrowth, yeah? With the supply chains regulation, I'm very in favor of that, supportive of that, but still think that like, if we want global justice, we have to deglobalize at least partially our economies. We have to get to much more responsibility within countries and within regions for their whole social metabolism. For example, we have to stop trading waste. We have to process the waste where the waste is generated. We have to stop externalizing environmental costs and social costs and appropriating cheap labor from elsewhere. And that would lead into a much more radical direction that only trying to keep more in line with human rights and environmental, the right to a clean environment in the supply chains. It would mean reducing the global supply chains and localizing the economies. My vision is a vision of concentric circles in the economy. Everything that can be solved at the local level has to be solved there. Everything that can be solved at the subnational level has to be solved there. Everything that can be solved at the national level has to be solved there. Then the region, and only last would be the global economy. And what we have done in the last decades is just the opposite, because it was cheaper, but it's less responsible. I don't know if I make myself clear. The next thing, Thomas Rosati, thanks a lot for that question, because it allows me to clarify that I am, of course, aware of the conspirations of the vested interests from fossil fuels and nuclear power against the renewables. And this is not, I'm totally against nuclear power. The thing is that the form, the shape that we have given our transition to renewables is a corporate shape, a mega project shape, and there is the problem. Yeah, the renewable energies in themselves are very positive. If we go far beyond only a shift in the energy source from fossil to renewable, this is not enough. What we say, and this is the example from Colombia that I have not been able to show you anymore, we have to decentralize energy generation, we have to democratize the access to energies, we have to give people control about their energy generation and use, and we have to reduce energy use, degrow energy use, instead of always planning for more and more and more. And this implies a change in our modes of living, in our understandings of well-being. How do we get to use less energy and not always more? So the thing is moving out of the corporate logic, of the mega project logic, of the global trade logic, where also the green hydrogen has to be bought from some places elsewhere, and to move out of the externalization logic. But of course, nuclear energy is not at all a solution. And the last question is maybe the most difficult for me. Latin America is a very, very fragmented, politically fragmented region right now. But I still have hope because of the very massive uprisings we have seen in many countries also in the last years, that the social discontent and the force of like the capacity of community building and of social organizing will be able to rebuild what had been a historic opportunity only a few decades ago, with when we had what I would call a progressive hegemony, but then we delegated it too much to governments to take all these decisions. So I believe in social organization, in pressure on governments, but also in taking matters in our own hands and creating peoples to peoples relations between local alternatives and also between the global north and the global south.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I think even though myself and everybody would have a lot of points still to raise, I think we have to move to the next session. As you know, in Germany, everything has to be punctual apart from Deutsche Bahn. So we unfortunately have to move to the next session, but maybe just one last thing. I think if people want to know more, they can also read your new book, right? I'm not going to ask any profit margins, but I recommend your new book. And I'm sure that this discussion will continue in some form or another. Maybe next time we will have you in person, which probably is also easier and nicer to continue these discussions. But I think we are all very grateful for you to have given us this very thoughtful and compressing presentation. And hopefully we will reason and reflect a lot on what you said.
Thank you very much, Daniele. Just a little hint, the new book, The Geopolitics of Green Colonialism, is available for free. It's now open access online if anyone wants to look into that. Thanks for mentioning it. And I am very sorry I couldn't interact more directly with you, but I am very grateful for your listening and for your questions. And even if anyone wants to write to me, I would be happy to respond. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Have a
Miriam.
very good conference.